Hi, welcome to Map Making in Fantasy Worlds. This is Colin Driver. I'm Jeff Richard, and we did the huge maps. I don't know if anybody saw the Glorantha maps that were over at booth 337, but These are huge, gigantic maps of the fantasy world, Glorantha, and so that's kind of our claim to fame and qualification for talking about cartography is having done a $250,000 plus Kickstarter project, which is fundamentally a map making exercise. Anything else on the?
I think it's about it.
And here we're here to talk about the process of making maps in a fantasy setting and for a fantasy setting,
and how we came to do it in the first place. How we came by it. I mean, my first, I don't know whether everyone else here was like this, but I was given one of these lovely globes when I was younger, and I used to love exploring it and trying to work out all the different countries, which most of them have sadly changed since then. But yeah, that was my first introduction. I found that quite fascinating, and then as a kid I started reading things like, oh, this is classic Tolkien, and yeah, this is what really started me wanting to actually do my own maps. We came to quite an early stage, so
yeah, just
you probably recognise this one.
Old classic. I mean, one of the things that's really developed in is the audience expectations of what a map should look like. If you all remember the old classic maps of dungeons from, which is this one from?
Yeah, it's Keep on the Borderlands.
Keep on the Borderlands. The maps are basically filled in grid squares. And there's a much bigger expectation that maps ought to be more aesthetically impressive and make more sense than this. I mean, simply as a believable underground structure, this does have a few questions of how believable any sort of underground maze like this would be. But
it was terrific for actually putting figures on and marching them around. But yeah. I think over the years we've come to expect more and more of the maps that we actually see in games, and anyone who used to play Baldur's Gate, this is the map that came with the game, and I think online gaming has taken map making forward quite a long way over the last few years. For example, WoW, that's not a particularly good one, but it gives you an idea. Obviously it's looking at Northrend and not the other continents, but I think WoW,
let's just kind of jump forward a little bit here.
Okay.
Jump forward through a few of these.
And of course the beginning of Game of Thrones is just iconic.
And that was actually, well, when we get into the project that we worked on, but this was some of the thing of going, my God, this is, how do you start doing more creative representations of places and locations? And of course, we didn't have an HBO budget, so we didn't manage to pull off anything that awesome. But
I think last year's winner, which was Jonathan Roberts, also did parts of Land of Fire and Ice. Brilliant stuff, excellent, and I would say go and see his website. It's well worth a visit. So it's the kind of thing he uses Photoshop, and this is how I kind of got into it a few years ago. I was given an old map by Greg Stafford, which reminded me a bit of the maps by Tolkien, and it's a very early one that I did, and this you can see how I've actually overlaid. This was my modern take at the time of overlaying something onto one of Greg's maps.
And I don't know who all know. Greg Stafford is the founder of Chaosium and creator of the world of Glorantha. Also did Pendragon and was one of the creators of Call of Cthulhu. And we do. Our company now has all the rights to RuneQuest in Glorantha, and we did a huge map book, and we did this Kickstarter for it, which is what we're about to jump into.
Yep.
And this is an example of the source material we had. Now, we were really lucky in this, is that Greg, over a 40-year period, has made these beautiful hand-drawn maps, hundreds and hundreds of this for his entire fantasy setting. The problem with them is although they're absolutely beautiful and they're gorgeous things, and many of them hang, the originals hang up on my wall framed, they're also done in a way that is absolutely unsuitable for publication in a fantasy book. I mean, a lot of them are in terrible shape.
Yes.
If you look at the Southern Ganartella map, what he did, this is back in the 70s, he cut out a bunch of huge pieces of paper and drew on them. There's holes, you can't really see it, but there's holes from the number of times that he erased locations or drew new locations. And the same thing on his other map. And these actual maps are about what, this big?
Yeah, they're massive.
Absolutely, massive. Like that big. And this, you get a lot of the old writers. This is, if you're asked to do a map in their setting, this is your source material, is these hand-drawn, beautifully hand-drawn maps, but you've got to convert them in some sort of a format that's actually...
Yeah, it's all on tracing paper, so it's a bit of a nightmare. So anyone who actually produced maps from these maps, sometimes because of the perspective, they didn't have something that they could scan it in or photograph it at the right angle, the maps would come out slightly distorted and wrong. So yeah, it's only with sort of modern techniques that we've actually managed to get these flat and in a position where we can start actually working on them.
Let's just skip over a couple of these.
First area we actually started on.
Okay, so these are some again.
Yeah, let's put that.
These
back.
are again some of the, and for people that just like making maps, what Greg Stafford's technique in making these hand-drawn original maps for the Glorantha setting is he did everything on tracing paper. And then when he wanted to put another layer of detail on it, he put a new piece of tracing paper over the old tracing paper and just trace all the details, and ultimately end up with this beautifully layered hand-drawn map. And that's the only way that he could think of back in the 70s and 80s to be able to have consistency within a setting. And so we've got rolls and rolls and rolls of this huge tracing paper material, but it's a bitch to scan. It's a bitch and a half to scan, and you can't really use it. And you've got to hire another artist, which is what we did with Colin. And do we jump right?
Well, the next one actually will show you how he actually joined them up, because it's got Skyfall Lake over here. So the corner of that other map is up here. So this is another entirely different map that we're working with, but it matches up perfectly with the last one. And this is really detailed. So this was we had a number of maps that we used at different levels of detail. This was our go-to map.
Yeah, and we were then, when we did the Guide to Glorantha Kickstarter, a big part of that Kickstarter was we said we are going to map the entirety of Greg Stafford's Glorantha setting, relying on all of his original maps. And pretty much what we've got, the rest of what's prepared here is the process by which we did this. And,
indeed, yes.
And are happy to talk about any, I mean, that's what we have here, but we're also happy if anybody wants some other questions or has any questions, feel free and jump in and have us talk about what, yeah. So this is also ways, we had to join all these maps together, Photoshop or scan them in, and then had to figure out ways to have them overlapped, because of course there is no master map. But he did all of this in tracing paper, which fortunately kept everything actually so it would line up. But just actually being able to get all of the underlying maps into one single image was a monstrous nightmare.
It was.
But that's the first thing you have to do is you've got to create, what is your underlying template there?
So yeah, I mean, this is what we had from Greg's detail to start off with. We then looked at, you can see some of the contour lines there.
And some of them are just plain wrong.
Yeah,
once you start pulling out, you start dropping out the layers. And we also decided that we were going to have this be a contoured map with one contour for every 1,000 feet. And then realized, because you got a lot of high mountains, that we had to have a cutoff point at some point, because above, when you have a 25,000 foot peak and you're doing 1,000 foot contour lines, what you end up with is a gray line. because it looks ugly. It looks hideous. So we had to figure out what point aesthetically we would say is the maximum altitude that we're going to bother tracking. It's a fantasy setting that's basically Bronze Age in technology. So we said, okay, 10,000 feet, there's no point in doing a contour line higher than 10,000 feet because nobody's ever going to go up that high.
So this was our first and second. This is what we worked out was correct, because Greg even supplied maps which had things like rice growing.
Yeah, there was an insane, I mean, this was the advantage of working with Glorantha, is it's an insanely detailed setting. But this was the first obstacle. And I don't know, who always tried to make it a believable, good campaign fantasy map? Everyone here. All right, who always tried to do contour lines? All right, first bit here is having believable contour lines. You know, that's a big issue. And in Glorantha, it's pretty easy because this is one of the great rivers in the setting, the mighty Osler River. And we know that this whole area has flooded before. So it's got to be, you know, you've got to have a fairly flat plain. But you've also got to, we know that there's got to be a variety of mountain ranges here. First bit of exercise is developing contour lines that are believable, which is, can be a tricky exercise. And a big part of it is sitting around looking at a large variety of different topography in the real world in order to get a feel for what is realistic elsewhere. Now Colin and I, although I grew up in California and Washington State, which is a common, in order to have believable locations, I often look at, you know, what's in California or what's in the state of Washington. Washington is wonderful in that it has a wonderful set of very, very varied topography, going from, you know, lowland regions in the southwest of the state to Mount Rainier, which, if you pop up on a contour line like this, you know, Mount Rainier just rises up, you know, about here, kind of out of nowhere. And actually, if you plop that down, it's a really bizarre and cool looking set of contour lines. Same thing with a lot of California is, but Colin comes from the UK. Now, in the UK, when you tell somebody something's a mountain, and you're trying to tell a UK cartographer, well, there should be a mountain range here, it's maybe 3,000 feet high. Maybe. Because, you know, to the English, an anthill, frankly, is pretty much, you know, as an aside, I remember going through the, what is it, the Pennine, what's the Pennine?
Oh, the Pennine Way.
The Pennine, used to be called the Pennine Mountains. And if anybody knows their British history, that used to be a great dividing area between the you know, small Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, because it was hard to get the armies over this. And
yeah.
I remember Greg Stafford and I, you know, talking about this and imagining it was going to be really, really rough terrain. And when I finally went through there in that area, I was going, you know, God, these are beautiful rolling hills. It kind of looks a little bit like the nice parts of Kansas. It's really lovely with some trees. But when are we going to finally get there? And it's why you've been driving through here through the mountains for the last 3 hours.
Yeah.
And this is a cultural construct thing in what is believable. Because if you're coming from a very, very flat land like the UK, we had criticism of some of the maps because we had too many mountains. And it's simply not believable to have people living in an area that's very mountainous, because that's just not possible. Now, I live in Germany, and my wife is from an area of Germany called Oberbayern, Upper Bavaria, which is right near the Austrian border, and that's exactly what that area is like. It's densely populated, divided by 8 to 12,000 foot mountains.
Yeah.
So that's one of the big issues. First issues, though, on developing any fantasy map is trying to figure out what is a realistic topography for you and your setting. And this is, again, this is the process as we built that up.
From various places, well, different maps as well.
Yeah, and then here we tried to figure out roughly where are the areas that should be heavily forested. You can see the beginning of us trying to figure out forest overlays.
That was from the
yeah, Greg, this was from a very old map from the late 1970s or early 80s.
There you go.
Yeah, And so Greg had drawn, even more insane, he had drawn on sheets of tracing paper at some point in the past, the heavily forested regions of parts of the world.
And when you see these, you think, well, what's that for? How does this match up with any map that we've got? So you have to find out, work out where the lakes are and the seas, and then think, oh, hang on, that probably fits on this map here. So yeah, it was quite a job of actually finding all the maps, matching them up, and even up to the last minute, we're finding new ones that were buried away in people's lofts and things. That
let's go forward.
yeah, let's.
Okay, so this was the complete version. So the final version of this. Now this is compressed, and it's actually intended to be displayed at a much greater size than this. You can't even see the hexes on this. So
no, you can't.
Let's zoom. Is there one where you zoom in a little bit more?
I'm not sure we can on this.
All right, let's just go forward a little bit. But this just gives the level of detail. And again, here's another area of the setting of what we had to work off and what the final ended up looking like.
So yeah, this is it going across.
Let's just go forward.
Yeah. Oh, you're mentioning Ken and Robbie. This one. This is the Kickstarter.
Okay, now here was so then we did the big Kickstarter. Go back one. And one of the things we promised to do in the Kickstarter was to take this region of the setting, of which this is the only detailed map that Greg ever made of it. And this doesn't line up with anything. It wasn't done in tracing paper, it was done by a third-party artist, but it was the only thing we had to work on. And this is another thing that will commonly happen when you're asked to generate a fantasy map is, here's a bit where you have a map that doesn't really fit. It wasn't done by the original creator. You've got to find a way to fit it into your image, but you also don't really have that much to work off.
Yeah.
And so, in the next slide shows what we ended up doing with it to be able to keep the. We had to change the topography a little bit because it didn't. Nothing lined up correctly. But this is what the complete map of the northern continent ended up being. And I think, how big is this map in reality?
The whole world is 19 foot by 19 foot. This is about 14 foot across.
Yeah, so this should be displayed at 14 feet across, is the level of detail that we were asked to do it at.
Yeah.
So this was all done in Photoshop, right?
And
it was all done
even more insane, it was done entirely in Photoshop, because that's what we knew how to work well. Exactly. And we could work quickly. And there are better programs for it.
I think
objectively. Illustrator is objectively a better program to do it, but we didn't know how to. Colin was way more skilled in Photoshop than you were at that time.
Absolutely. We wanted to get the project finished so that people had their Kickstarter. It took us a while anyway, but I think I've been changing into using another program like Illustrator or perhaps Campaign Cartographer. It would have
added a year to the project.
Exactly. So love those programs, but just to finish this one off, we actually use Photoshop, as do a lot of map makers, I think, or GIMP. Yes.
Since you mentioned the other software packages, can you talk maybe just for 30 seconds, 45 seconds about each one of those and what advantages, disadvantages they have?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, yeah. Well, with Campaign Cartographer, there's a lot of pre-made stuff that you can get in the annuals, so that you can actually put things together quite quickly and really make it your own style. And they bring out kits and things about every 6 months. I think there's a new version of the software coming out very soon. But with that, you can actually buy the annuals. You can say, right, well, I want to construct maybe a town. I can get this set. I can add these in. So that Campaign Cartographer for that is ideal. It's brilliant. GIMP is a bit like Photoshop, but it's free. But it doesn't have all the bells and whistles that you can actually use in this. Illustrator is a vector tool application. So you're actually creating vectors using Bezier curves for all of you. You'd have to do a single line draw around one bit of the sea, for example, and then you'd build it up in layers again. And the
awesome thing about it, the awesome thing about it from a publishing and the layout perspective is it beautifully scales.
Yes.
Zoom in, zoom out.
Yeah, because it's vector. And what that means though is that map, you can do that map at a number of different projections and sizes, and it keeps beautifully the image.
Yes.
I mean, on retrospect, if we had known that, if we had had the time to do full training for Colin at the time in Illustrator and Vectors, if we knew back then, we would have done this in Illustrator.
Because we can actually pull that into different applications as well, like campaign cartographer.
Yeah.
So
It's really easy to port over things done in Illustrator.
Let's follow up to his question. Yeah, they're each great tools. Crap. The lines. Not
Yes.
here.
The contour lines?
Yes, thank you. How would you even import contour lines into like a brand new generation in Illustrator or campaign cartographer?
into Illustrator, you bring in the original picture and trace over it.
Okay.
And you use the pencil tool.
Oh my god. Okay.
Yeah.
At that point you're talking like a Wacom tablet because your mouse is going to cut it unless you're really skilled.
Yeah, it takes a bit of time. I've actually recreated a bit of this map in Illustrator, because we're thinking of maybe going along those lines and seeing what we can do with it.
How many layers went into this?
Yeah, just give an idea what how many layers and the size of, and this is, by the way, we'll go forward a little bit, but this is literally only 30%?
Yeah, probably
Or
30%.
if even 30%, maybe 25% of the full map we ended up making on this. Yeah. Keep in mind,
It's not even 25%, Jeff.
It's not even 25%?
We have the whole world map in our booth, 337. We have it as a 7x7 backdrop banner. This isn't even the top third.
Yeah, the full map is 40 feet by 40 feet.
Yes.
All right? And we had to create that whole map because that was one of our big pledges in the stretch goal. It was like 40 feet. Yes?
So how long does this all take you?
How long did, okay, weirdly enough, this part here, this 20% took the longest.
Yes.
And the reason it took the longest is this we had the most source material. And so we had to have the absolute we had the least ability to fill in any blanks or to take anything that made it easier. So this, we literally had to redraw every single map that Greg Stafford, one of the most prolific game designers, had written in his magnum opus game over a 46-year period. So the amount of material that we had on this is mind-boggling.
Yeah.
We stored all the maps at my place in Berlin, and we have an area we were calling the vault.
Yes.
And literally what the vault is, Michael's been over to the vault, and so has Colin a number of times. It's a gigantic, it's a room of nothing but these ancient tracing paper maps in tubes, all little inventoried, so that we would know which one that I had to be referring to, and we had to scan in, or in many of these they were impossible to scan because of their size.
We had photographed and they were blown up.
And we had to, that's because that's what you know, at a certain point it becomes so cost prohibitive to do scanning, because we're talking hundreds of huge maps. We're not talking, you know, hundreds of stuffs that some guy made on an 8.5 by 11 sheet piece of paper. We're talking something that a obsessive world design, you know, and Greg Stafford is one of the top tier world designers out there, did in his biggest project of all time over pretty much his entire adult lifetime on an unbelievable variety of tracing paper.
Oh yeah, even cut bits out of the tracing
We'd cut
paper
bits
and
out
put
if you
other
didn't like
bits in
them.
and
Tape
stuff
a new
like
bit
that.
over.
Tape a new bit over it.
Yeah.
That's what we had to work with. So this took how many years?
The 2/3 of that before the Kickstarter took me part-time about 2.5 years.
Yeah. So to here, over, took 2.5 years of doing it as a regular part-time gig. I mean, it was, then we did the Kickstarter. And this we had ready in time for the Kickstarter launch. And the Kickstarter, we threw as the insane, what we thought was the unrealistic top tier stretch goal of $125,000. We said, we'll map the whole setting. We'll just map out the whole setting.
Yep.
Well, $260,000 later, we now have an obligation to map out the entire rest of this world, 40 feet by 40 feet,
yep.
in a, what was the amount of time that we gave ourselves, a year?
A year.
Oh my.
Full time.
Okay, but fortunately the Kickstarter had enough money, it had the money, and part of the thing about the Kickstarter is we will hire Colin full-time to do nothing but this. Right, so this became a full-time professional gig for Colin. Every day.
You've seen it in your dreams when you go to that night.
I went slightly mad. Every tree, well, not every tree, most of the trees.
Oh yes, this was another thing about it. The trees are not painted in group.
No.
They're individually placed.
Oh my God.
Because otherwise it would lack fidelity. I mean, because when you start doing it,
Looks
a
like a
certain
pattern.
Yeah, it looks like a pattern. It looks crappy. And
THX commercial in my head now.
so this becomes the fun part. So we're here. It took us how long just to do this bit?
About 5 weeks, 6 weeks.
Yeah, to do this bit, we're going, oh crap.
Yeah.
Because this is now are we now at 25% for this one?
Almost.
Yeah, almost 25%.
And we had to.
So
look at
then,
other maps.
this was what we had to go on island groups, keep going down. So we spent about 2 weeks to turn that little bunch of sketches again. This is that big
Yeah.
group of islands.
Oh,
No,
yeah.
but this started becoming easier. Yes.
You mapped out the currents in the ocean?
Yes.
Yes.
It was a stretch goal in the Kickstarter. They wanted
Because
to go
Greg
trade
had them.
routes.
Now this gives you an idea of how insanely detailed Glorantha is. If you love world building, if you love fantasy world building, in the world of fantasy settings, there's basically Harn and Glorantha for levels of obsessive detail. Tekamal, fortunately, I mean, if anybody's familiar with Tekamal, he was just obsessed about linguistics and not about maps. But Greg is obsessed about maps. And so if you love world building and you're unaware of the Glorantha setting, you should check it out because it's Harn level of craziness. And probably now, so this was our master map of the whole world.
That's second age.
Right, so see that continent that we did before? That's how much we had just done in 2 years. And we were beginning to get a little anxious on this. And that little island group here, oh yeah, he did the maps of how things changed over history. So this is actually an earlier, yeah. So keep going.
The geological shift.
Magical destruction in mythic events and so
Yeah.
forth. Because it's a mythical world where everything operates based on mythical conflict. And it's a flat world, to make it even...
So Mercadian?
What?
Mercadian?
It's...
You know how those world maps are Mercadian? They're kind
Yeah,
of
no.
distorted, big screen, they're like really huge.
Yeah.
No,
It's
it's
really
just
not.
flat.
No, it's you know, everybody familiar with the Greek concept of how the world was? You have a flat, truly flat world spike, and the sky really is a dome. Well, that's how Glorantha really is. And that also twists how you make the maps.
Oh my God.
Let's keep going.
Okay.
So, other insane things, Greg we also promised that we would do demographic and political maps for everything here. And so that was my task. So how many of whatever sorts of folk it is, where are the, Gloranthan elves are very different from Tolkien and D&D based elves. They're associated with forested areas. So how many elves are there going to be in a particular region? We have a couple of other. And then the eastern part of this map is this insane archipelago, of which Greg did work out
pretty much where every damn island was and did it consistently. And that's what we ended up doing on that. Now, give an idea, that's about 25 feet if you put it out there. And if you look at this, whoops, sorry.
Other one, other one, other one.
Put it in the 220 slot.
220 slot.
Yeah, this one here. That's the one. Do we have to turn it on?
Carry on.
So, if you check this out, to give an idea, this is one of the things we resulted in is a 120-something page atlas.
132.
132 of each one of these pages here, done in not the maximum, but what we thought was the good presentation level of it. Okay, thanks. Once we have that, we'll go to the next slide here. Unless anybody's got a yes.
Is the red light power switch on?
Yeah, it's done green.
Yes, the atlases are for sale. The guide to Glorantha, the final Kickstarter project is for sale. All of that is there.
So what inspired you to decide to take on this project in the first place?
One, the creative director for Moon Design Publications, and so this is our business.
I was just a crazy fan who just enjoyed putting things together.
And an old buddy of mine.
Yeah.
And I said, hey, Colin, I got an interesting project for you. And it kind of grew and grew and grew, and then he became a crazy fanatic.
Yeah.
Having nightmares about trees.
Oh, yeah.
Just make sure the plug's in there.
Yeah, it's not that, it just needs to come down. It was abruptly shut down, so it just doesn't like that. It wants that down.
Okay.
Just like you could buy from that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I think you should redraw it on the wall.
What?
The white waste
Well,
later.
Yes.
About you said trees, but how small do you get? Like, what's about the smallest you get on the map? Like,
Okay, what we broke the map down to is that some of you might be familiar, but probably not very many, with a war game that came out in the mid-70s called Dragon Pass or White Bear Red Moon. And what we wanted it to be is the scale of projection we wanted to be able to do is we wanted you to be able to play essentially White Bear Red Moon over the entirety of the setting. This was kind of a geek design thing. We didn't quite get that level of detail because it would have, we realized that was just absurd. But it's all broken down, and if you zoom in, it's all hexed, and the hexes are all 5-mile hexes.
And they're about a half inch.
just topped out again.
Half-inch hexes, 5 miles ahead.
This is that's
Move the table forward.
Did you ever count the number of hexes across?
Oh.
we did at some point, but it was absurd.
It's
Yes.
4,000 miles.
Have you? Is there any location where you printed out the whole 40-foot by 40-foot map and put it somewhere?
7 by 7. 7 by 7 is the largest we've ever printed, but we do have an awesome banner printer that if somebody really
In
wanted
theory,
that
if you
yeah.
wanted to blow a couple grand, you could commission the printing of enough of the banners, because we have it set up that you can pick the location of the thing that you want to have on your 7-foot by 7-foot banner, and I guess you would have to go, you know, about 6, so it'd be about 36 banners, all 7 by 7, and you could get out the whole world. To just give you an idea of how big the map that we did here. So if you've got a room in your place, you know, if any of you guys are software billionaires and you've got a room in your place that you want to, you know,
Or you can project it full size.
you can just project it down.
No, we can't.
Can we jump forward one, because this will eventually be fixed? Ah, yes. Anybody else, while we have a technical difficulty, does anybody else have any? Yes.
So this is based off RuneQuest, right? I'm not familiar with the
Okay,
rules.
RuneQuest was the first RPG. It's actually way older than RuneQuest. But
okay.
RuneQuest was created for it.
Oh, okay. Awesome.
It actually is. It actually predates. Glorantha as a setting predates role-playing games, and it's because Greg started writing the Glorantha material in '66. It was originally going to be for short stories in science fiction and fantasy, and he ended up wanting to make a war game, which was White Bear Red Moon, and then that became RuneQuest. And as an interesting tweak of history, the very first copy of the very first version of Dungeons and Dragons, right off the print, was purchased by Greg Stafford. Which he unfortunately then got rid of.
And one of the writers of the current version of RuneQuest is the guy who's been mucking around
Yeah,
with
so the
the
current writer of RuneQuest,
AV guy.
the AV guy is the writer of RuneQuest.
Yeah.
One of the other things we promised in this is we would create a map of the red moon, which is the moon floating above the world in the middle of the sky. We did not promise we would go to that level of detail, but we did have to create kind of a cool moon concept in case your adventuring party somehow ended up on the moon. This was a side project. Now Colin didn't do this. I worked with a French artist to generate this, Eric Vanel. We also promised we would create maps of the mythological eras before time that created the setting. And again, I worked with a French artist to generate these. So just, we also...
Hey, Jeff.
Quick question,
Yeah.
is the moon round? Or is
The
it
moon
flat?
is spherical, but it doesn't move.
Okay.
It just sits in one place.
That's only a few hundred miles above the.
It's only a few hundred miles up.
Okay, just wondering.
So they're not spelled.
Now, this was another, we had to create an entire map of the major constellations and brightest stars in the sky, which Greg also had. I think he had somewhere around 40 different tracing paper layers on this to be able to show the movement of stars and planets in the setting. And I worked with a French artist to create this star map. So fortunately, Colin didn't have to do the underlying star map. But then late in the project, we decided, wouldn't it be cool to show how some of the big mythic battles that go on in the setting were reflected in the sky? So we did, Colin and I put this one together.
And all the star shapes.
Constellations.
Yeah, and the constellations, we decided to also then take and show the, focus up on a number of the constellations. I think about 9 or 10 constellations, which Colin pulled together and put the overlaying images on it, you know, in between breaks of making a 40-foot by 40-foot map.
What you should do in your free time.
Also in this, and this is also kind of a thing on world building, we did distribution maps of where various species, various cultures were associated. And that, did you work on that one?
I did a little bit of work.
You did some of the cleaning up.
Yeah.
That's mainly Simon Bray, who's another very talented cartographer from the UK. And so this is what the final complete map was. Now, what saved our butt on a 40-foot by 40-foot map is there's a lot of ocean. That actually is what probably made this possible.
It's funny you say that, because Greg actually said to me today, we haven't mapped the bottom of the ocean yet.
Yes, because he has a map of the various abysmal trenches.
Yeah.
But we didn't do that. We didn't do that. But this is what the final, so if you can imagine this thing here at 40 foot by 40 foot, we had this done. And quite amazingly, we not only got this done in our self-imposed deadline within it, but before our artists managed to finish one of the other things that happened in the color plate is we managed to get funding for how many additional full color pieces? With about 40?
36.
36? Full color pieces. So actually we finished before the artists did on that. Yes?
So this is a flat map, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
So what happens at the world's edges?
Well, at the world's edges,
It's not a globe.
it's not a globe. It's actually, this is the middle world. Beyond this is a circular river that's endless. Beyond the circular river is the sky dome, which just basically rises about like that, and that's where the stars actually are on the sky. It's a dome.
Yeah.
Is that all that we have?
I think
on the
that's
plate?
it. Yeah, I think that was it.
So now it's basically whatever you know, if anybody has any questions on you know, this is at least our experience on map making in fantasy settings. Yes?
Have you tried making like your own map from scratch? I mean,
I have, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, I have. I've done a few.
What do you start with, like?
I actually start with the shape of the where the sea hits the land. So you're putting the shoreline in. That's normally what I start with, and then I try and work out where civilizations would be growing around the rivers, things like that, and then I start building it up from there.
Two questions. First, do you plan to do the abysmal trenches?
Yeah. Well, you know, if somebody paid us to do the, I don't think there's. I don't think. Yeah. Well, Colin may wake up in a cold sweat, going, "Oh my God, I haven't done the abysmal trenches. It's not complete," and may do that. But from my point of view,
There's always another layer.
Yeah.
From my point of view, I don't think that there is exactly a gigantic market for a 40-foot by 40-foot map of the abysmal trenches at the bottom of the sea of Glorantha.
Well,
but if there was, you never know.
And my second question was, if you want to take these maps and use them for a war game, what would you have to change about them to make it work?
Not a whole lot. You just have to you take, what I would do is I would take the PDF images, zoom them up, because they do scale up to actually close to about the right size. It's just, they won't fit all the counters printed at the level that, in the size that Dragon Pass did. The hexes are just, end up ultimately being just a little bit too small. But what I would do is, and what we did do when we played last summer, at a German convention, or I think 2 summers ago at a German convention, we ran a war game using one of the big poster maps of this. And we, instead of using little flat chits, we had little pillars on a counter counter and use them to move it around. It actually looked a lot cooler, and it worked perfectly. Yeah, and that's one of my kind of ulterior motives of it, is that that's the sort of stuff I enjoy doing.
Did you choose to use horizontal or vertical X's, and why?
What we did is we chose to use the same hex layout that was in the Dragon Pass war game.
Yep.
So why the Dragon Pass war game used? I believe it used. Did it use horizontal?
It's vertical.
Vertical. It used vertical. To know why it did that, you have to ask Greg why he chose what that is. But we wanted it to be able to map out. We wanted the people that grew up on Dragon Pass or on the Griffin Mountain game to be able to go and lay their map over it and go, yeah. And that was the reason we chose the layout. But that's actually a good question, because there's actually some issues about, you know, what it encourages in terms of troop movement if you have hex-based movement.
Greg is at the booth. Come on over and ask him.
Yeah, he'd be happy to ask that. He might not know, but it was his choice. Anybody else got anything, or how are we doing on time?
About 15 minutes.
Okay. Who's got?
Like 20 of them, but I don't want to dominate the conversation.
Well, if nobody else has got any questions, go for it. Shoot.
Okay. First and easiest. When you're DMing the game, because ultimately it's made to interact with. When you're DMing the game, yeah, you got this huge continent. Let's say, for argument, let's just call it the USA. Not North America, because Canada is actually bigger than New York. So you have this big strategic map, and you're like, okay, you're going to this point somewhere along the Mississippi River. You have this huge map. As a DM or as a map creator, you might be going all over the place up and down Mississippi, the Ohio Valley, Massachusetts. How can you break these down? Like, it's not great fidelity. You want to break it down into a 50 by 50 mile map. It might be 30 by 24 on your kitchen tabletop. How do you do it? Or as a DM, how do you get consistency, or do you just fudge it and say, this is the Ohio Valley?
Well, what I do, because I'm also I'm do a lot of GMing, because I'm the creative director on new design, and with Robin Laws and I wrote the newest edition of the Hero Quest rule system, and worked with Robin a lot on so I run a lot of games, and I use maps, actually as storytelling. It's less important actually for the players to necessarily even see the map or have it as a way of options. I use maps as kind of
abilities to come up with encounters or things that get the story or the action moving. The players say, I want to go from St. Louis to Chicago, and this is a Wild West game. Well, what sort of things were there between St. Louis and Chicago? The first thing I ask as a GM, because how can I make that, do I want to make that an interesting, the travel part, because that would be, you know, in a Wild West game, that'd be a significant journey. Long journey. What sort of things, by looking at a map, what sort of obstacles can I throw in to generate random encounters or maximum game fun? You know, would it be a kind of a cool, would this be a cool thing for the players to have to overcome, you know, a raid by the Shawnee? Would that be something interesting? Would that be appropriate there? Would it be interesting? Well, you know, I'm looking at the topography of this, probably doing the good, the bad, and the ugly scene with Clint Eastwood and Tuco going through the desert isn't going to be appropriate there. And that's really, for me, that's the biggest role at all on maps, is they help me create the experience better and to throw details that that kind of pull out the world for the players. If that's...
I'm kind of wondering, because you said that like the northern continent was by far the most detailed, but it sounds like everywhere had tons and tons of detail. But I'm sure that like, especially in some of the less detailed areas, there were points where, you know, cities or like river names or whatever might not have been filled in. So I was kind of wondering, like, did you just choose to leave those areas blank? Like,
No.
if you find a river, so you were kind of had the license to come up with names or fill in cities or whatever.
Okay, now here's the advantage, because I'm the creative director of Glorantha, and we own, Greg sold us the,
you can do
the
whatever
setting.
you want.
And Greg and I have been writing together we worked it out over 20 years. So I know, and I also was writing at the same time, the Guide to Glorantha, which is the 800-page encyclopedia of the setting. So I know the setting really, really well. And I'm one of the Sandy Peterson, Greg Stafford, and I are pretty much one of the creators of the setting in its current form. And so I felt comfortable that I could come up with new topographical, geographical, and political details.
Well, we
that
had
would,
to,
yeah.
because that's what we did as stretch goals in the Kickstarter. It's like, this part of the world, nobody's ever named the rivers, said how many cities there are, that kind of stuff, and that's what they really, really wanted. And so as those stretch goals kept getting accomplished, it's like, okay, Jeff, there's another 1,000 miles of terrain you gotta come up with, cities and names and rivers. And
when you were doing cities and towns, villages, areas, were you doing anything about how many, the population per square mile?
Absolutely.
What's the average population?
Depends on the culture. Depends on what I divided stuff in. If anybody's ever read Ferdinand Braudel, the French historian who wrote a huge treatment on the Mediterranean as a social ecosystem, wonderful for world design, by the way. He divides human cultures into hunter-gatherer, I think it's hunter-gatherer, pastoral nomad, chieftaincies, and then urban-based. In each of those, I gave a different approximate population per square mile, and then depending within the realm of civilized culture, some had higher, some had lower, and then worked that out as what would be appropriate. And fortunately, a lot of that work had been done by Greg Stafford and Sandy Peterson, who did unbelievable amount of details on that, because they consider that a core part of any world building exercise.
Yeah,
and they do that early on in it.
What were your highs and lows, if I can ask?
I've got a piece. Ask me at the booth, because I actually have that written down
Okay,
somewhere. No, it's a very. I developed charts and charts and charts of it, but I did that 2 years ago. So some were surprisingly high, but I also read a tremendous amount of academic. From a friend of mine gave me a JSTOR subscription. And so I was searching through on what are estimates of high and low for Bronze Age and Neolithic cultures. So I mainly relied on academic literature that I could get off JSTOR. So, and then one of the guys who's very heavily involved in Glorantha, Oliver Dickinson, is the retired professor of Aegean prehistory at University of Durham, and is considered an expert on the Bronze Age Mediterranean.
You can pick up his books about Glorantha, or you can pick up his academic works. And he gave me some helpful hinters on folk that have played around with demographics. So if you pester me at the booth, I'll try and look up some of that. The last question, then I got to get out of here because I got to run a game. I'm sorry.
Sorry. But have you considered trying to upload this to something like Google Maps?
It has, yes.
We are looking at that.
Cool. Awesome.
Yeah. One last question, and then I got to zoom.
What was the Ferdinand book? Yeah, sorry.
The which?
Ferdinand.
Ferdinand Braudel, I believe it's just called The Mediterranean.
Yeah.
How do you spell Braudel?
B-R-A-U-D-E-L, I believe. Very easy. If you do a Google search anything like it, it'll come up.
So stuff in there about literal zones.
Yeah. Yeah, he was one of the big guys of looking at the relationship between trade, socioeconomics, and ecosystems. And was also one of the one of the first big historians who tended to look at much bigger social ecosystems rather than saying we're going to look at Spain. We'll look at the whole Mediterranean, because the only way I can understand Spain is to understand everything going on in the Mediterranean. Yes?
I was wondering, how many miles across is Glorantha?
4,000.
4,000.
Give or take a few.
Okay then.
Oh, that's a lot.
Yeah.
But it was 800-ish?
But it's to have the feel of the ancient world. So that these continents are aware of each other. So it's not like
That's not a whole world.
It is a whole world, but in a fantasy setting, one of the problems about Earth in a fantasy setting is so much of it's wasted.
Yeah.
You know, if you're doing a campaign set in Tang Dynasty China, well, the entire half of the world is wasted because it doesn't exist. So why, you know, but I'm really, really sorry I've got to run off to a game. I hope you guys enjoyed that.
Jeff, you